start by telling us a little bit about Clear Bright Future.
So Clear Bright Future argues that we're in a triple crisis. We've got an economic system that doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work for most people in the developed world. People can't see how their child's life is going to be better than their life. The economy is stagnating. The sources of growth are running out. And there's climate change. On top of that, we've got evaporating consent for the political institutions we have, for democracy, for universal human rights, for the rule of law. And this is leading to the rise of a new authoritarian conservatism and in some parts of the world, fascism. The third problem is not as well understood. It is the problem of technological control, the machine control of human beings, which is already here in the hands of elites and governments using surveillance and behavioural control, algorithmic control, to turn large parts of human life for some people into a kind of airport. You know, like you go through an airport, it's like a controlled algorithm. Do this, give your fingerprints. Are you really you? Prove it. Then you can pass to stage 2. Large parts of human life are set to become like that. Personal interactions with doctors, personal interactions with baristas in coffee shops are already programmed. Now for me, each of these 3 crises, economy, politics, technological control, is rooted in what I call the crisis of the neoliberal self. Neoliberalism for me is the economic system of the last 30 years where economics replaced all other dynamics, morality, humanness, everything's economics. It was fine while it worked, but now it's broken. And as a result, the selves we moulded around the realities of a free market economy and a highly individualized economy, those selves are in crisis. And this is what's driving all the other stuff.
So these selves you talk about, at one part in your book you mention millennials and the snowflake generation directly. And the criticisms that they're sort of used to getting are along the lines of they're the sort of the natural extension of the sort of hippie movement in the 60s, which focused on the self and the individual being at the centre of the universe. But you provide quite an interesting defence of this generation. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, look, I want a snowflake insurrection. I want us to take the word snowflake and throw it back at our oppressors in the same way as gay men in my youth used the word queer. To say, no, we are snowflakes. We are individual, unique, fragile. We melt in the end. We disappear. You know, the word snowflake comes out of a scene in Fight Club, in the 1990s movie, which was meant to be a critique of toxic masculinity. It's become like the Bible, like the lad Bible of toxic masculinity. The guy says, you are just a piece of crap on a dung heap. You're not a special snowflake. Now, I believe human beings are more than a piece of crap on a dung heap. We have a teleology. My theory of human nature that I draw from Marx is that human beings have human nature has a history, that we are born technologists, linguists, imagineers, and that makes it possible for us to liberate ourselves from necessity through technological change and from self-oppression through the mass transformation of human beings through education and culture and liberation ideas. Now, I think that makes us more than a piece of dung on the dung heap, and I think if we grasp that's the solution to a liberation project. Now, of course, the individual human being brought up in the digital era, the so-called millennials, the so-called, even the Generation Y with the earphones, yeah? There are problems about the way they have been addressing collective resistance. There is a tendency, what's the problem? The tendency has been arising from postmodern ideology to see everybody as the oppressor of everybody else. I think it's also true that many of us participate in the oppression. I, as a white man, certainly do. Straight white man, certainly do. English, British, I participate in all kinds of oppression. But the good thing about centering the resistance on yourself as the starting point is it's irreducible. When people say, I'm sick of the students demanding the right to not have hate speech, I'm sick of the trigger warnings. No, I like trigger warnings. I like to say that students have a right, for example, to not have a hate speech perpetrator on their campus. Why? Because what the new oppressors, the neo-reactionary movement, want us to do is to start dividing human beings into biological hierarchies. Alpha males are better than beta males better than women, whites better than blacks. Okay? The danger of all that is that you can't fight that just from, you can resist it, as it were, as the irreducible human being. Don't come in my space, don't oppress me, don't harass me, don't shoot me. You can do that, but we need to go beyond that. And the analogy I use in the book will be well known to people of my generation and my grandmother and grandfather's generation. The working class had to find each other and act together, collectively, but that wasn't enough. They also had to formulate in their minds an objective. And I think what this more looser resistance of networked individuals from many classes, with many backgrounds, and with many forms of oppression that are stifling their lives, first phase is find each other and act. And the second phase is formulate an objective.
So you talk about networked individuals. That's quite a new term.
It's not that new, you know, but go on.
So if you could sort of explain what you mean in terms of your book.
So the sociologists as early as the 90s observed that that hierarchies that had been formed in industrial society were breaking down. So the family, the urban working class area, the structured workplace with its hierarchies, were all breaking down. And the first use of the networked individual term was to describe people who had to network because they lived in suburbs. They didn't use devices, they had to physically join a squash club. They had to go to a toddler group, just to meet people, because work and the society that they lived in had been dispersed. But once we got digital technology added to that, the sociologist Manuel Castells describes the networked individual as someone who is spontaneously anti-hierarchical. That is, your generation moves between many different groups and networks in your life.
I do, to be honest. I have adopted the digital lifestyle. Where we're at home is in cities, where we can move from one group to another. We can deploy multiple selves. My father's generation had to have one self. To have two selves was to be a liar, was to be false. No, the people who suffered from this were people like gay men, who had to have a real self and a fake self. But in general, that world of hierarchy and the single self has disappeared, and now many people are juggling multiple selves. It's seen by many people, kind of reactionaries of my generation, as a bad thing. I don't think it needs to be a bad thing. It can be something that empowers you to be able to know that you are capable of deploying the multiple self. But in the end, that multiple self has only one body and only one world in which to act in the analog space, in the wet world of human beings. And therefore, the networked individual needs to be, the words find each other and act, we don't come out of my book. They're from a manifesto called The Coming Insurrection, written on the eve of the 2011 uprisings by these anarchists from the so-called Invisible Committee in France. But they said, and I believe this, the proletariat, my granddad and grandma, they had the workplace in which to find each other, in which to work out who's virtuous, who's an asshole, who's going to break the strike, who's going to beat their partner, their wife in a traditional family, who's not. We have the whole of society in which to find each other, but we need to find each other through the network, and then we need to act.
So it's interesting you talk about the 2011 protests. 2 months ago, we saw a really distinct style of protest in the form of Extinction Rebellion. I'm sure you've got a lot to say about this, but yesterday it was announced that the Met are going to try and push prosecution on all of the activists, 1,100 activists who were arrested. Now, I saw a Facebook post that referenced Mahatma Gandhi. First they ignore you, first they ridicule you, then they fight you, then we win. Yeah,
well, it's going to take a little bit of time to win, because we're not just up against the state, nor even is the state the biggest enemy of XR, or of the other groups like Me Too or Black Lives Matter. Even Black Lives Matter. It's the problem is what the German philosopher Hannah Arendt called the temporary alliance of the elite and the mob. And we're up against a temporary alliance of authoritarian elites who keep their money offshore, who are heavily invested in fossil fuels, surveillance technologies. Yeah, these are what these guys, and of course by investing in offshore, that is anti-taxation, they're effectively investing in anti-society. Now, that's on one hand. There are large numbers of people who need to believe that climate change is not real, who need to believe that women are subordinate to men, because in their world will disintegrate in the next 20 years because of the changes we need to make. Your generation cannot go back into the box that my grandmother's generation of women had to live in, or gay men, or transgender people, or black people. You can't de-network a society. You can't unliberate a generation, okay? So XR, for me, is the latest iteration of the new kind of protest that is almost the son and daughter of 2011 and the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement imagined a new society, and we assembled the forms of that society on the internet, the networks, and then we took it into physical space in the form of tent camps and square occupations. They didn't last. They were easily repressed. Extinction Rebellion, Me Too, and Black Lives Matter take it to a visceral level, to a granular level. If you think about what BLM is saying, is that the wages of whiteness is that if a policeman arrives on a trouble scene, black people get shot and white people generally don't. That's why these racists spend all their time on the phone trying to call the cops on black people for selling water on the street. What they hope is the cop will arrive and shoot somebody, and it ain't going to be them. Now, that's a very different thing than saying, I need civil rights. I need civil rights for Martin Luther King, for Malcolm X, etc. Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, was a real thing, but to say you no longer have the right to shoot me when the cops turn up is a different, more granular thing. It demands changes of human behaviour. Me Too demands a change in human behaviour. I work in the theatre sometimes. The theatre is undergoing a revolution because of the demand of female actors and producers no longer for their physical invasion of their body space under the excuse of the theatre. I'm not just talking about directors saying, let's have a drink after work, by the way, you'll get a lovely part in my next film. No, it's about the actual physicality of theatre is changing. There's now a movement that helps people act through whether they have to do a sex scene or a sexual violence scene. Both these things exist in reality and should be portrayed on stage. But now we have movements where we mediate those and we allow people to explore what is happening to them in a much more reflective way than before. So what I'm describing there is the way Me Too is not just transforming kind of the agenda of feminism, it's transforming a real industry. It's also transforming parts of corporate life, not enough. There are now tests and courses, they call them the Weinstein test in corporate life. Can you pass the test? Otherwise you don't become a director of this bank. So the amazing thing is that, going back to XR, that we've got here, what's XR's number one demand? Tell the truth. We're at a philosophy festival where routinely people question the possibility of truth, but I don't, and I think that's another thing. There are truths, they are provisional, they're scientifically verified, we need to fight for them. And I'm delighted that the XR has come out. Of course the state are going to repress it. It's going to be wake-up time when some quite, I'd say, young and therefore inexperienced protesters, my generation of climate protesters, the people I collaborated with and reported on, have been trying to say, look, the cops will come. Soon there will be people arriving in your camps who look unstable. You need to deal with them. You need, in a good way, we need to educate and care for people. But what the cops then do is that they, like the evil doctor, they look at the thing and they go, at an entity, and they occasionally, it doesn't have to be our police, it can be another country's police, it can be a private security company you've never heard of. They say, what are the illnesses and weaknesses of this thing? How can we make them worse? That's what happens. It's what happened to the tent camp outside London Stock Exchange, that it was quite clear somebody was exacerbating all the problems. And I don't believe it's the British state. I believe, that the whole world is now a kind of outsourced. There's a kind of state mischief making that's outsourced to private companies we've never heard of. You saw it around Cambridge Analytica and its parent company. But we can defeat them. We are millions of people. And what is more, they have sons and daughters who don't want to live in a burning planet. So in the end, we can have an argument. Even with the kind of shittiest private intelligence company. Do you really want to live on a burning planet with chaos, with millions of refugees unstoppably moving from the global south to the north? If you want to live in that planet, go on disrupting the climate change movement. If you don't, then even it might, you don't like people with green hair and nose rings, fine. Just do it yourself. Lobby your Tory MP or your Republican congressperson. Tell them to stop funding climate chaos.
I think the thing that's really interesting about XR as well, possibly from your perspective as a Marxist, would be this isn't something that's going to be successful on a single national scale. It's going to have to require a global.
Yep. This is why, for me, although I am critical of institutions like the European Union, IMF, World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, all the architecture of neoliberalism has been global. And there are people on the left who think that it's a good idea to break it up, break up the Western order. I don't. I want to reform it. I want to reform globalization. That means sometimes doing less of it. Okay, less TTIP. Less globally focused privatization of public services. More state intervention. I think we're going to need big state intervention into the energy production systems of most big countries. It might need to just be taken by the state and demobilized very quickly with huge losses for the investors. That's something I wouldn't do unless we really had to do it, but it might need to be done. And therefore, for me, as a Marxist, I do see the state as something we need to use in order to be able to do this, and elites are going to be our enemies, and we're going to have to, through a mixture of kind of conversations and action, I think there is a model whereby we get somewhere, but none of us can underestimate the urgency now that the IPCC's report of October 2018 injects into the situation. See, I just don't think capitalism can deliver the radical change in consumption and production of energy behaviour that we need in 10 to 15 years. However, I'm obliged to accept we need to try and do it with a radically reformed form of capitalism. We have to. The human resources are not there for an anti-capitalist movement to win elections. The corporations are clinging to the climate model. The economists are clinging to their economic models. So what I want to do in the next 10, 15 years of my life is to, using what we have, institutions like parliaments, economic models, climate science that we have, and the persuasive, there's a fly attacking me, good, biodiversity is not dead yet, the institutions that we have to enact that radical change. It will probably feel like a non-capitalism because there won't be climate giants. There won't be energy giants. There won't be politicians in the pockets of coal and oil and steel companies. They're all gone if we save the planet. But it might still be a market economy with a big state sector, and in my project, a huge wiki sector, a huge open source, collaborative, non-profit sector. That's a good enough goal. I'm 59. I think by the time I die, I think we can actually achieve that. By the time you die, we can solve climate change.
Paul, thank you very much. That was a really good interview.
Well, the book's called Clear Bright Future for a reason. Cheers.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.